After years of no contact, parents sit me down and give me a letter. So I open it, and they tell me it's time for me to take risk and help the golden child to treat her infertility. Growing up, it was always clear that my sister Mary was the favorite. She's 2 years older than me, 33 now, and it was like she could do no wrong in my parents' eyes. I mean, she was the classic golden child. My mom would go on and on about how pretty she was, how athletic, how smart. Basically, she was everything they ever wanted. They'd even call her their golden apple or baby pie. Meanwhile, I always felt like I was in the background, like an afterthought. I was born 2 years after Mary, and let's just say I was not part of the plan. My parents didn't hide the fact that I was a surprise. On top of that, I was born premature, with a heart condition. The whole situation with my health became another reason for them to treat me differently. I was in and out of hospitals my entire childhood, and every time they'd make these passive-aggressive comments about how much money I was costing them. I can't even count how many times my mom would say something like, "We'd be better off if we didn't have these medical bills." It always made me feel like a burden. But here's the thing, they didn't even pay for most of it. My grandparents covered everything that insurance didn't, but somehow my parents still held it against me. Looking back, I don't think they ever forgave me for being born with a heart condition. It's like they were resentful that I was an imperfect child or something. And while they were busy treating me like a drain on their resources, Mary was getting treated like royalty. She got all the praise, all the attention. She was the star athlete, always the pretty one, and they acted like she was some sort of blessing from the heavens. But it wasn't just my parents. Mary herself played into this whole thing too. She knew she was the favorite, and she took full advantage of it. She was mean to me, like straight up bullying me, and my parents just shrugged it off. I remember one time she shoved me down the stairs because I accidentally touched her school project. I had a bruise on my back for weeks. My mom's reaction? She told me to be more careful around Mary's things. It was like I was invisible unless I was causing them a problem. It was lonely growing up like that. You'd think having an older sister would mean we'd be close or something, but no. She didn't want anything to do with me unless it was to make fun of me or blame me for something. And my parents just let it happen. It wasn't like they didn't see what was going on, they just didn't care. Mary was perfect in their eyes, and I was just there. School was my only escape, but even then it wasn't easy. My health issues meant I missed a lot of days, so I was always behind. And of course, Mary would get straight A's and go to all her sports practices, while I struggled to keep up. My parents never missed a game or a school event for Mary, but for me, they barely showed up to anything. One time, I got an award for a short story I wrote, and I begged them to come to the ceremony. They didn't. They said they were too busy with Mary's soccer game. It wasn't just the big stuff either. It was the little things, too. Like, every year for our birthdays, Mary would get these big, elaborate parties. She had themes, decorations, and tons of friends over. My birthdays were always smaller, quieter. I didn't even get a real party half the time. They'd just say, "Oh, we'll do something next weekend," and then forget about it. The worst part was seeing how happy my parents were when they were around Mary. It was like they became different people. They smiled more, laughed more. When it was just me and them, there was this weird tension, like they didn't really know how to act around me. By the time I was in high school, I had learned to just keep my head down. I didn't want to rock the boat. Mary was already doing well for herself. She was on track to go to a great college, and she had tons of friends. Me? I just wanted to get through each day without feeling like a failure, but even that was hard when my parents constantly compared us. "Why can't you be more like Mary?" they'd say. "She's doing so well. You should try harder." It felt like no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. Even when I did something right, like getting good grades or doing well in a school project, they'd just brush it off. But the minute I made a mistake, they'd be all over me. I remember getting a C in math one time, and my mom flipped out. She acted like I had ruined my entire future. Meanwhile, Mary could get away with anything, and they'd just laugh it off. It was exhausting, always being second best. I never felt like I could be myself around my family because I knew they didn't really care about me. They cared about the version of me that didn't exist. The one who didn't have a heart condition, who wasn't always sick, who could keep up with Mary. But that wasn't me, and it never would be. The real breaking point for me came when I graduated high school. I was so done with the whole situation, I just wanted to get out. I begged my grandparents to help me go to college far away from home. I didn't care where. I just needed to get as far from my family as possible. My grandparents, bless them, were the only ones who ever really supported me. They paid for my college, and I went several states away. I can't even describe how good it felt to finally leave. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in Mary's shadow. I could just be me, without constantly being compared to her or reminded of how much I was costing my parents. Looking back, it's wild to think about how much they messed with my head. I spent so many years thinking I wasn't good enough, that I was a burden. But now, I see it for what it was, just messed up favoritism that they tried to pass off as normal. But even though I escaped, the damage was done. It took years for me to shake off the feeling that I wasn't worth anything. Even now, there are moments where I doubt myself, where I wonder if maybe they were right about me all along. But then I remind myself that it wasn't my fault. It never was. After I left home for college, things really started to change for me. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. Being away from my parents and Mary was honestly the best thing I could have done for myself. It gave me a chance to start over without all the crap that came with being the unwanted child. I was finally free to be my own person. College was where I met Greg, my husband. I remember the first time we met. It was during one of those awkward icebreaker events in the dorms. I wasn't expecting much, but there he was, just being his genuine, kind self. He wasn't like anyone I had met before. Greg didn't care about appearances or what I could do for him, which was so refreshing after a lifetime of feeling like I wasn't good enough for anyone, especially my own family. Greg and I clicked instantly. He was patient with me, which was something I wasn't used to. He listened when I talked about my childhood, about how I always felt like I was in the background. And he didn't judge me for it. He just made me feel, for the first time, like I was worth something, like I actually mattered. He made me feel beautiful too, which was another thing I wasn't used to. Growing up, I was constantly compared to Mary, who was always the pretty one. I was never good enough in that department, or at least that's what I was told. With Greg, I didn't feel like I had to compete with anyone. He loved me for who I was, and for the first time in my life, I started to believe that maybe I wasn't as worthless as my parents made me feel. After we graduated, Greg proposed, and of course, I said yes. It wasn't long before we started planning the wedding, and Greg's family was super supportive. They were thrilled about the whole thing and offered to help pay for the wedding. My family, on the other hand, not so much. When I told my parents I was getting married, they didn't even pretend to be happy for me. My mom straight up said, "We just spent a fortune on Mary's wedding last year, so don't expect us to contribute." It was like I wasn't even their daughter. I tried not to let it get to me, but it still hurt. I mean, it wasn't like I was asking them for anything extravagant. I just wanted them to show up, to care, to be there for me. But they couldn't even do that. They didn't come to the wedding. Not my mom, not my dad, and definitely not Mary. They didn't even send a card. Nothing. It was like I didn't exist to them anymore, which honestly wasn't that different from when I was growing up. But I was determined not to let it ruin my day. Greg's family was there, and they were amazing. They made me feel like I was part of something real, like I finally had the family I had always wanted. Greg's mom even helped me pick out my wedding dress, which was such a small thing, but it meant the world to me. She treated me like her own daughter, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Our wedding was beautiful. It wasn't some huge fancy event like Mary's, but it was perfect for us. Greg and I got married in the city where we graduated, and it felt like a fresh start for both of us. We decided to settle down there, far away from the toxic mess that was my family back home. I kept in touch with my grandparents, of course, but outside of them, I barely spoke to my parents or Mary. Life was good. Greg and I built a life together, one that didn't revolve around constantly trying to prove my worth to people who didn't care. For the first time, I was genuinely happy. And then came the news that changed everything. I was pregnant. When I found out, I was a mix of emotions. I was excited, of course, but also terrified. Because of my heart condition, I knew pregnancy would be risky. My doctors had warned me about it for years, but now it was real. Greg was over the moon when I told him, but I could see the worry in his eyes too. We both knew this wasn't going to be an easy journey. The pregnancy was tough, as expected. There were complications almost from the start, and my doctors advised me to terminate early on, saying it could be fatal for me. But I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to go through with it. Greg supported my decision, even though he was scared out of his mind. We both were. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. I was in and out of the hospital, constantly being monitored. The strain on my heart was intense, and there were days where I wasn't sure if I'd make it. But despite all the odds, I did. We both did. My son was born healthy, and I managed to survive, though barely. The doctors were clear. They told me in no uncertain terms that I couldn't risk having another child. My heart just couldn't handle it again. And Greg and I agreed. We were happy with our little family, and we didn't want to push our luck. Looking back, I don't know how I made it through that time without losing my mind. The whole experience was terrifying, but Greg was my rock through it all. He never left my side, never once made me feel like I was doing this alone. And that's something I'll never forget. He's been the one constant in my life, the one person who's always had my back. After our son was born, things were quiet for a while. We were focused on raising him and just enjoying our life together. It wasn't easy, but it was ours, and that was enough for me. I had finally built something good, something that wasn't tied to all the pain and rejection I grew up with. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. After a few years of just living our lives quietly, something I didn't think would happen, happened. We moved back to my hometown. It wasn't really by choice, though. My grandpa's health had started to go downhill fast, and he was the one person from my family I actually cared about. He was getting older, and the last thing I wanted was for him to pass without me being close by, you know? So Greg and I talked it over, and we decided to move back just to be near him. I wasn't thrilled about being back, not gonna lie. The thought of being around my parents and Mary again was enough to make me nervous. I knew how things were when I left, and I wasn't expecting any miracles in the years that passed. But I didn't want to regret not being there for my grandpa, and that was more important to me than dealing with old family drama. When we first got back, I tried to keep my distance. We moved into a place on the other side of town, far enough that we didn't have to see my family unless we wanted to. I figured I'd just visit my grandparents, check in on them, and avoid my parents as much as possible. That was the plan, at least. But of course, nothing ever goes as planned when it comes to family, does it? From the moment we got back, my parents and Mary were acting different. Like, really different. All of a sudden, my mom was calling me, asking how I was doing, telling me how proud she was of everything I had accomplished. I mean, where was all this when I was growing up? It was like they had suddenly decided to flip a switch and become the loving family they never were. My dad would send texts every few days asking how Greg and I were settling in. Even Mary, who had always treated me like I was beneath her, was suddenly super nice, making an effort to chat with me whenever we bumped into each other. I wasn't buying it, though. You don't go from being treated like crap your whole life to suddenly being the favorite child just because you moved back home. There was something off about the whole situation, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Part of me wanted to believe that maybe they had changed, that maybe they realized how horrible they had been, and this was their way of making up for it. But deep down, I knew better. Years of that kind of treatment don't just disappear overnight. I talked to my grandma about it, and she told me to give them a chance, that maybe they did miss me. I don't know, maybe they did. I was willing to keep an open mind, but I wasn't about to let my guard down completely. Then, 2 weeks after we moved back, my parents invited us over for dinner. Now, I've been to enough family dinners with them to know that it's usually not just about food. There's always some kind of agenda, but Greg convinced me that maybe it was just a nice gesture. Maybe they were trying to reconnect or something. So, against my better judgment, we went. When we got to their house, everything seemed normal at first. My mom made her famous lasagna, which was one of the few things I actually missed from growing up. We sat around the table making small talk, and I could almost fool myself into thinking it was just a normal family dinner. But then, halfway through the meal, Mary said she had a surprise for me. She was sitting across from me with this smug smile on her face, and I instantly felt my stomach drop. Surprises from Mary were never good. She reached into her bag and pulled out a card. It was one of those fancy-looking envelopes, and she handed it to me like she was giving me some kind of award. I was confused, but I opened it, expecting maybe some kind of apology or a thank you note for moving back to be closer to the family. But nope, it wasn't that. Not even close. Inside was a letter congratulating me for becoming her future baby's carrier. I kid you not. She wrote it like I should be honored or something, like it was some privilege to risk my life for her. My first thought was that this had to be some kind of joke, but the look on her face told me she was dead serious. I couldn't believe it. I just sat there, staring at the card, trying to process what was happening. When I finally managed to speak, I told her I couldn't do it, that I physically couldn't carry another child. My pregnancy with my son had almost killed me, and the doctors had been very clear that I couldn't go through that again. I tried to explain it, but before I could even finish, Mary burst into tears. Now, normally I wouldn't have cared if she cried, but my parents reacted immediately. My dad started yelling at me for being selfish, and my mom chimed in saying that I should do this for family. It was like they didn't hear a word I had said about my heart condition, about how dangerous it would be for me to have another baby. The whole thing turned into this huge argument with my parents and Mary ganging up on me, telling me that I was a terrible sister for not wanting to help her. I was in shock. I tried to stand my ground, but it was hard when they were all shouting at me like I was the worst person in the world. Greg, thank God, had my back the whole time. He stood up and told them we were leaving, that this was insane, and they had no right to expect me to do something like this. We grabbed our things and walked out. The drive home was quiet. I think we were both just in disbelief over what had just happened. Even now, thinking back on it, I can't believe the audacity of it all. I get that Mary is upset about not being able to have kids, and that sucks for her. But the fact that they thought it was okay to just spring this on me, to assume I would risk my life to carry her child without even asking me beforehand? It's beyond messed up. I haven't spoken to them since that night. Part of me feels guilty, like maybe I should have handled it differently, but at the same time, I know I did the right thing. My health comes first. Always. The silence after that dinner was deafening. Days passed, and I didn't hear a word from my parents or Mary. Not that I was expecting them to apologize, but a part of me hoped they'd at least try to reach out, to explain themselves or something. But no, it was radio silence. Greg kept telling me I did the right thing, that I wasn't wrong for standing my ground, and I knew that deep down. But it still left me feeling, I don't know, guilty? I shouldn't have felt that way, but I did. It's weird how family can mess with your head like that. The thing that got me the most was how quickly everything turned. One minute, they're acting like they missed me, like they're so proud of me, and the next, they're screaming at me for not risking my life for Mary. I mean, who does that? Who goes from 0 to 100 that fast? It was like I was some tool they kept on the shelf for years, and now that they needed me, I was supposed to just jump at the chance to help. But here's the thing. I wasn't surprised. Disappointed? Sure, but not surprised. This was how things had always been. Mary got what she wanted, no matter what, and I was always expected to just go along with it. Growing up, I'd seen it over and over again. It didn't matter if I was sick or struggling or hurting. If Mary needed something, that's where their focus went. So, when it came down to it, they didn't care about what my pregnancy did to me. They only cared about what it could do for her. A few more weeks went by, and I started to get used to the idea that maybe I wouldn't talk to my family again. I mean, how do you come back from something like that? I couldn't just pretend that dinner never happened, and I sure wasn't about to risk my life to carry a child that wasn't even mine. Greg and I talked about it a lot, and we both agreed that going no contact might be the best thing for us, for our family. My son didn't need to grow up around people who treated his mom like that. Then one day, out of nowhere, I got a message from my mom. It wasn't long, just a text that said, "We need to talk." No, I'm sorry, no, let's work this out. Just a cold, emotionless, "We need to talk." I stared at my phone for what felt like forever, trying to decide what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to block her number and move on with my life. But the other part of me, the part that still craved some kind of validation from my family, wanted to know what she had to say. I showed Greg the message, and he was pretty firm about it. He told me that if I responded, I needed to be ready for more drama. He was right, of course, but I still couldn't help myself. Against my better judgment, I replied. I kept it simple, just asked, "What do you want to talk about?" Her response came quickly. She said she wanted to meet, that it was important. I asked if Greg could come too, and she immediately said no. That was a red flag if I'd ever seen one. Why couldn't my husband be there? It wasn't like I had anything to hide, and if this was really about fixing things, shouldn't he be involved too? But no, she insisted it had to be just me. Despite all the warning signs, I agreed to meet her. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe some kind of heartfelt apology, or at least an acknowledgement of what they'd done, but I should have known better. We met at a coffee shop in town, one that I hadn't been to in years. When I walked in, she was already sitting there, sipping her drink like it was just a normal day. No guilt, no remorse on her face, just casual. Like this was a regular catch-up between mother and daughter. I sat down, and before I could even get a word out, she started talking. She didn't ask how I was doing or mention the dinner. She jumped right into it, saying that Mary was devastated and that I needed to reconsider my decision. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There was no apology, no, "we were wrong." It was all about Mary, again. I sat there stunned as she went on and on about how Mary's life had been so hard, how she and Dad had been working to find solutions, and how I was the only one who could help. She even pulled the "family sticks together" card, like that meant anything coming from someone who had ignored me for years. When she finally stopped to take a breath, I told her as calmly as I could that my answer hadn't changed. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. I reminded her of what the doctors said, about how dangerous another pregnancy would be for me, and that I wasn't willing to take that risk, not for anyone. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd understand. But instead, she looked at me like I was some kind of monster. "You're being selfish," she said. "Mary needs you, and you're just turning your back on her." I couldn't believe it. After everything I'd gone through, after all the years of being treated like nothing, she had the nerve to call me selfish. I told her that I wasn't turning my back on anyone, that I was protecting myself and my family. But she didn't want to hear it. She kept pushing, kept trying to guilt me into agreeing. It was like nothing I said mattered. That's when I realized something. My family was never going to change. They were always going to see me as second to Mary, and no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried to explain myself, they would never understand. In their eyes, I existed to serve her, and the minute I refused, I became the villain. I stood up, told her I was done, and walked out of the coffee shop. I didn't look back, didn't wait for her to respond. I was done. Done with the guilt, the manipulation, the constant feeling that I was never good enough. I wasn't going to let them drag me back into their toxic mess. Not anymore. When I got home, Greg was waiting for me, and I told him everything. He wasn't surprised. He knew, just like I did, that this was how it was always going to be. But now? Now I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, relief. I was finally free. After walking out of that coffee shop and telling my mom I was done, I really thought that might be the end of it. I mean, how many times do you have to slam the door shut before people realize you're not opening it again? But of course, they didn't get the hint. A few days after the whole meeting with my mom, I started getting texts from my dad. It was the same thing all over again. "Your mom told me what happened, and we need to fix this. You're tearing the family apart." Tearing the family apart? Really? It's funny how they never said anything about the years of neglect or the way they treated me growing up. But now I'm the one tearing the family apart because I won't give them what they want. It was so typical. Everything was always flipped around so that somehow I was the bad guy. I didn't even respond to his messages. I couldn't. I was done trying to explain myself to people who clearly didn't care about me in the first place. But it didn't stop there. My phone was blowing up. Mary, of course, started texting too, only her messages were a lot more intense. She didn't even try to pretend she wasn't angry. "How can you be so selfish? You owe me this. I would do it for you in a heartbeat." First of all, that was a lie. Mary wouldn't do anything for me, let alone carry my child if I was in her position. She wouldn't even give me a ride to school when we were younger if it was out of her way. I don't know who she thought she was fooling, but it wasn't me. Her whole "I would do anything for you" act was just another way to guilt me into doing what she wanted. The messages kept coming, and I just couldn't take it anymore. It was like no matter how many times I said no, they refused to accept it. Greg kept telling me to block their numbers, to just cut them off completely. But it's hard, you know? Cutting off your family is a big decision. And even though I knew it was probably the best thing for my mental health, part of me still wanted to keep some kind of connection. I guess I wasn't fully ready to let go, even after everything. A few more weeks passed, and it was quiet again. I didn't hear from them, which honestly made me a little uneasy. I kept waiting for the next round of guilt trips or manipulation, but nothing came. I tried to focus on my own little family. Greg and our son were my world, and that's where my energy needed to be. But in the back of my mind, I knew something else was coming. It was just a matter of time. And then, it happened. One day, out of nowhere, I got a call from my grandmother. She's always been the one person in my family who truly supported me, so when I saw her name on my phone, I picked up immediately. I expected her to ask how things were going or check in like she usually did, but the second I answered, I could hear the tension in her voice. "Sweetheart, I don't know how to tell you this, but your parents are planning something. You need to be prepared." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, planning something?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "They're talking about going to a lawyer. They're saying they'll take legal action if you don't agree to help Mary. Something about medical rights, surrogacy, I don't know exactly, but they're serious." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Legal action? They were actually going to try and force me into this? I was speechless. My grandmother went on, telling me that she overheard them talking about how they had a case, how they thought they could convince a judge to make me their last option, since Mary couldn't have children on her own. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This was beyond anything I could have imagined. They really thought they could take me to court and make me carry Mary's baby? The idea was so ridiculous, but at the same time, terrifying. I mean, who thinks like that? Who goes that far? I thanked my grandma for telling me, and we hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, just trying to process everything. I felt a mix of anger, disbelief, and pure frustration. How had it come to this? How did my own family turn into people who would try to legally force me to risk my life for my sister? I thought about all the years of being treated like nothing, of always being second to Mary, and I realized this was the final straw. I couldn't do it anymore. That night, I told Greg everything. He wasn't surprised. Angry, yes, but surprised? No. He knew as well as I did that this was just another way for them to control me, to make me feel like I owed them something. But I didn't owe them anything. Not anymore. Greg suggested we contact a lawyer, just to be safe. Even though it seemed insane, we needed to be prepared for whatever they might try. So, we did. We met with a lawyer a few days later, and I explained the whole situation. The lawyer was amazing, understanding, but also ready to fight for us if it came to that. She reassured me that there was no way they could force me into being a surrogate, especially with my medical history. But she agreed it was better to be prepared in case they actually tried something. A few weeks went by, and I didn't hear anything. No legal threats, no more texts from my parents or Mary. It was like they had finally backed off, but I knew it wasn't over. The damage had been done. I couldn't go back to pretending like everything was fine. They had shown me who they really were, and there was no coming back from that. One day, out of the blue, I got a final message from my mom. It was short and cold, just like before. "We're disappointed in you. You've let the family down." That was it. No explanation, no further guilt trip, just that one last punch to remind me of how they really felt. I stared at the message for a while, feeling the sting of it, but then I realized something. I didn't care anymore. I wasn't disappointed in myself. I wasn't the one who had failed. They had let me down my entire life, and this was just the final chapter in a long, painful story. I blocked their numbers after that. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Greg and I decided that for the sake of our son and our own sanity, we needed to move forward without them. They weren't going to change, and I wasn't going to sacrifice myself for people who didn't care about me. It's been a few months now, and life is quieter. I still think about them sometimes, but not with sadness. More like relief. Relief that I'm finally free from their expectations, their manipulation, and their control. I have my own family now, and that's all I need.